How did England's slickest spy get to do things like this when he came all the way from doing this? Grab your golden gun, your shaken martini, and take a seat in the Aston Martin, because today we're talking about
James Bond.
James Bond 007 is more than a movie series, it's a way of life. 007 originated as a book series by Ian Fleming, but found its true home on the silver screen in 1962, where he's stayed ever since. Entries are still being produced, making it one of the longest-running live-action film series of all time, currently at a whopping 27 films and counting. 6 different actors have played Bond, with each offering their own little twist, but the fundamentals of this character are consistent. Bond is a secret agent from a real-life British intelligence group, MI6. His codename is 007, and he has a license to kill. Each Bond actor brings their own take, and the movie's tones are all over the place, but some things stay the same. Gadgets, girls, cool cars, and death-defying stunts. The Bond series has won Oscars, topped the box office, and he even got to meet the Queen at the 2012 Olympics.
Good evening, Mr. Bond.
Good evening.
So without further ado, let's get into the movies. It's for your eyes only. The first movie, Dr. No, sets the template for the entire series, as almost every iconic element is included, starting with the opening gun barrel sequence and theme music. For being so old, that is really badass. But before we get to Bond, let's meet John Strangeways, a British Secret Intelligence Service agent on an assignment in Jamaica. He's about to report when he and his secretary get shot dead by the 3 blind mice, a trio of assassins posing as blind men. Ah, bye John, we hardly knew ya. MI6 tries to radio Strangeways, but discovers the signal is mysteriously jammed. So MI6 seeks out James Bond, who introduces himself with his famous catchphrase,
Bond. James Bond.
Strap in, because this guy really likes saying his name. Our first Bond is Sean Connery, who many swear is the best, considering how he was the original and brought so much class. Bond is busy, not doing spy work, but playing baccarat in a private London club. Damn, that's British as hell. One of his opponents is Sylvia Trench, our first Bond girl. These girls can be friend or foe, but are always foxy. Bond goes to MI6 headquarters and flirts with his boss's secretary, Mrs. Moneypenny, who's a frequent fling of Bond, but it's never serious. They really don't seem concerned about HR. It was a different time. Bond then meets with M, the head of MI6. He's the strong, all-business foil to Bond, who gives out missions and tries to keep his most rogue agent accountable. M tells Bond that Strangeways was helping the CIA investigate radio jamming of rocket launches from Cape Canaveral. They're also visited by Q, standing for Quartermaster. This is MI6's gadget guy. He upgrades Bond's gun and sends him straight to Jamaica. On landing, Bond accepts a ride, but it turns out the driver is an enemy agent. Bond overpowers the crook, but he bites into a cyanide-laced cigarette before 007 can get intel. Later, Bond meets with Jamaican government secretary Playdell Smith to learn about Strangeways' final days. Bond goes to investigate Strangeways' home, where he discovers a receipt from Professor Dent, a local geologist, and a picture of Strangeways with another man, Coral, a local fisherman. Bond sets out to question Coral and finds him cleaning his boat. He doesn't talk, but Bond follows him to a restaurant where they get into a messy fight in the back room. They're interrupted by CIA agent Felix Leiter, Bond's less cool American counterpart.
Felix Leiter, Central Intelligence Agency. You must be James Bond.
He tells Bond about a suspicious nearby island called Crab Key, controlled by the mysterious Dr. No. Coral and Strangeways collected rock samples from Crab Key and gave them to Professor Dent, all to aid Strangeways' investigation. Bond sets out to visit Dent, who tells 007 that the samples were a type of iron, but Dent is also working for the enemy. That night, he slips a tarantula into Bond's room to take him out. Wait, shouldn't a professor know that tarantulas aren't venomous? Nevertheless, Bond beats the absolute heck out of the spider. I guess he also has a license to squish bugs. The next day, Bond meets Playdell Smith's corrupt assistant, Miss Toto. On his way home, assassins appear and try to run Bond off the road. In the first of many chases in this series, Bond and Toto have, relations. But then, he gets her arrested. Dent shows up to kill Bond, but gets tricked by a decoy, and 007 shoots him. At night, Coral takes Bond to infiltrate Crab Key. There, Bond meets Honey Rider, a shell diver, in a bikini that was considered seriously less scandalous at the time. Anyway, Bond hides out with Honey as armed guards search the island. Later, Bond, Honey, and Coral encounter a dragon tank that breathes fire. It unfortunately kills Coral, while Bond and Honey get captured. They're cleaned up and then escorted to beautiful rooms. The next morning, Bond and Honey eat with their host, Dr. No, a Chinese-German scientist. Due to radiation, he had to get his hands amputated and replaced with super-strength prosthetics. Most Bond villains follow this template: exotic lair, physical deformation, and a love for being evil. Dr. No explains that he used to be a member of a Chinese secret society until he decided to rip them off for $10 million in gold. Now, he works for Spectre, which stands for Special Executive for Counterintelligence, Terrorism, Revenge, and Extortion. They're a recurring threat throughout this entire series. Dr. No wants to disrupt a US space launch to demonstrate Spectre's power. He tries to recruit Bond, but 007 is like, Doctor, no. The Doctor has Honey taken away, and Bond gets beaten up and then imprisoned. But Bond escapes through an air vent and then disguises himself as a worker to infiltrate the base. Bond reaches the controls and overloads the system as the launch commences. Dr. No fights him, but Bond throws him into the reactor pool and he gets cooked. Literally. Ironically, his hands are probably the only part of him left by now. The base starts to break down and everyone evacuates. Bond frees Honey and they get the heck out of there on a boat as the base explodes. They drive until they're out of fuel and get discovered by Felix, who has them towed to safety. But Bond lets go of the rope to buy himself time to make out with Honey. Man, he is a whore. The Spectre saga continues in the sequel, From Russia with Love, which arrived only a year later. We open with Bond on a mission when he gets taken out. Psych.
Exactly 1 minute 52 seconds. That's excellent.
This is Spectre headquarters, and these guys are being trained to kill Agent 007. But who's in charge of Spectre? Meet Ernst Stravo Blofeld, Bond's arch nemesis. We don't see his face yet, but he sure has a cute little kitty cat. Blofeld wants revenge for the death of his buddy, Dr. No, so he recruits Kronstein, a chess grandmaster, into his plot for Bond. They decide to use a coding device from the Soviet Union's consulate in Istanbul as bait. Also, at this meeting is Rosa Klebb, a former head of the Soviet Union's counterintelligence. She's assigned to oversee the mission and chooses trained killer Donald Grant to take out Bond. Klebb heads to Istanbul and tricks Tatiana Romanova, a clerk at the consulate, into filing a report on the decoder. But what's Bond up to? Oh, he's just hanging out with Sylvia Trench, but their picnic is interrupted by a call from Moneypenny. Bond reluctantly leaves and meets with M to get his briefing. Tatiana has requested Bond's help to defect to the West in exchange for providing British info on the decoding device, called a lector. M thinks this is a trap, but decides to still send Bond to help Tatiana. Before leaving, Q hooks Bond up with a briefcase loaded with more gadgets than Batman's utility belt, and a sniper rifle. Sick! Bond arrives in Istanbul and works with Ali Kerim Bey, an MI6 contact. They hang out, do classic bro stuff like watching a girl fight. Meanwhile, Grant secretly follows Bond. Eventually, Tatiana meets Bond at his hotel. She agrees to give him the console's layout so he can steal the decoder. They hook up, but are secretly filmed by Klebb and Grant, and you can't tell me that they did not make a copy for themselves. Later, Bond and Kerim Bey break into the embassy and steal the lector. Afterwards, Bond, Bey, and Tatiana escape Istanbul on the Orient Express. But the spy games don't stop there. The team is attacked by Commissar Benz, a Soviet security officer, who Bond takes out. Bond goes back to Tatiana and discovers that Grant killed both Kerim Bey and Benz. Bond is suspicious and questions Tatiana, which eventually leads to another round trip to Pound Town. Later, they board a train using one of the assassin's escape routes. The train arrives at its destination in Serbia. Bond receives instructions to rendezvous with a British agent named Nash, but Grant secretly listens in and kills Nash to assume his identity. Grant drugs Tatiana and overpowers Bond. He plans on leaking their tape, killing Tatiana, and framing Bond for the murder. Bond gets the upper hand by getting Grant to check out his special briefcase, which sets off a booby trap. Grant and Bond get into a fight that ends with Bond stabbing, then strangling Grant. Ah, the 00 special. They escape the plane, but the next day are attacked by Spectre helicopters and boats that Bond manages to take out. Back at Spectre headquarters, Blofeld kills Kronstein for his plan's failure. Klebb is sent to get the lector back. Meanwhile, Bond and Tatiana hole up in a Venice hotel. When Klebb comes to their room disguised as a maid, I didn't order room service. Klebb almost shoots Bond, but Tatiana knocks her gun away. Klebb tries to stab Bond with a poisoned blade in her shoe, but Bond blocks her, and Tatiana blows Klebb away. With Spectre defeated, Bond and Tatiana enjoy Venice as a theme song using the film's title blaring on the soundtrack, a tradition for the series from here on out. We end on a title card claiming James Bond will return. And return James Bond did in 1964's Goldfinger, easily one of the most iconic entries in the series. It all starts with Bond mid-mission, and whoa, he wore a tux under a scuba suit? Oh my God, that's cool. Anyways, Bond takes out a drug lab and settles in for his favorite activity, getting laid. But they're interrupted by a hitman. Bond takes him out via electricity and sets himself up for an epic quip. Nice. After the cold open, we drop into another cool title sequence set to a new theme song by Shirley Bassey, who's the only performer to have the honor of doing multiple Bond themes. Goldfinger! Next, Bond heads to Miami Beach, where he catches up with Felix Leiter. Felix recruits him to spy on a large, eccentric gold dealer appropriately named Auric Goldfinger, who's staying at a nearby hotel. Bond gets to it and finds Goldfinger cheating at a high-stakes card game, with help from his assistant, Jill Masterson. She looks at Goldfinger's opponent's cards with binoculars, but Bond stops her and causes Goldfinger to lose. Bond and Jill get to know each other when Bond gets knocked out by Goldfinger's top henchman, Oddjob, who has a really interesting power that we will see soon. Bond wakes up later to find Jill dead by being covered in gold paint, which causes suffocation through her skin. Bond returns to MI6 headquarters and gets briefed by M. Bond now has to figure out how Goldfinger is smuggling his precious gold. But before he heads out, he's gotta get a new gadget from Q. This time, a car. And not just any car, a souped-up Aston Martin with tracking devices. Thank you! Bond heads to Kent and meets Goldfinger at his country club, using the pretense of selling gold. They play golf and Goldfinger cheats, of course, but Bond gets the upper hand, causing him to lose. Goldfinger warns Bond against crossing him with a demo from Oddjob. Yeah, that's his power, a hat with a blade and super strength. Later, Bond tracks Goldfinger to Switzerland and encounters Jill's sister, Tilly, who wants to kill Goldfinger, but Bond convinces her to hold off. Bond sneaks into Goldfinger's refinery, where he eavesdrops on Goldfinger meeting with a nuclear physicist named Ling. Goldfinger tells Ling that he wants to smuggle gold through the body of a Rolls-Royce that is headed out of England. Goldfinger also alludes to Operation Grand Slam. I wonder what that is. Tilly is listening in too and accidentally triggers an alarm, compromising Bond. Oddjob uses his hat to kill Tilly and Bond is captured. He's strapped to a table made of gold, and Goldfinger gets maybe the best villain line in the series.
Do you expect me to talk?
No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die.
A laser cuts the table and slowly moves towards Bond's crotch. Not the crotch! Ooh, not the crotch! Bond gets out by lying to Goldfinger that MI6 knows about Operation Grand Slam. Next, Bond is brought to a farm Goldfinger owns in Lexington, Kentucky. His pilot is another henchman, this time a Bond girl, with one of the most ridiculous names in the series, Pussy Galore. Did a 13-year-old write this? This is also the first time we hear Bond's famous drink order.
A martini, shaken, not stirred.
In Kentucky, Bond is imprisoned but escapes quickly. He sees another Goldfinger meeting, this time with the Mafia. Goldfinger reveals Operation Grand Slam. He intends to break into the United States gold stockpile at Fort Knox by releasing nerve gas into the atmosphere to knock everyone out. The Mafia thinks this is ridiculous, so Goldfinger gasses them. Bond gets captured again by Pussy Galore. Damn, is he sloppy. In his cell, he learns from Goldfinger that the plan isn't to steal the gold, but to irradiate it via a nuclear bomb from Ling. This will cause the US economy to crash and burn. It's time for Operation Grand Slam. Pussy Galore flies her plane over Fort Knox and gasses everyone. Next, Goldfinger's army breaks into the building. Goldfinger himself arrives next in a helicopter. They blow open the vault. Bond gets brought in and handcuffed to the bomb. Goldfinger seems victorious, but what he doesn't know is that Bond secretly convinced Pussy to alert the US government and replace the gas with a harmless substance. Goldfinger only cares about himself and locks Oddjob in the vault with Bond. The US Army arrives next and Goldfinger escapes. Inside the vault, Bond frees himself and fights Oddjob, but his punches don't seem to hurt. Eventually, Bond gets the upper hand again, using his old friend, electricity. Shocking. The US Army storms Fort Knox and opens the vault. One of their bomb squad guys turns off the device and checks out the remaining time. 007 seconds. Get it? Get it? Bond is sent on a jet to meet with the president, but it gets hijacked by our old friends Goldfinger and Pussy Galore. On the plane, Bond and Goldfinger fight, and Goldfinger's gun fires, opening a window which decompresses the plane. Goldfinger is forced out of the window. The plane goes down, but Bond and Pussy parachute to safety. Felix Leiter flies by in a helicopter to find them. Pussy tries to alert him, but Bond drapes the parachute over both of them instead. Man, is this guy ever not in the mood? Up next, we've got the return of Spectre in Thunderball, which honestly sounds more like a move from Pikachu than it does a Bond movie. After another cold open mission and an epic title sequence, we cut to an eye patch wearing weirdo. This is Emilio Largo, Spectre agent, also known as Number 2, which I'm not even going to make a joke about. It's too easy. He wants to control NATO by ransoming 2 atomic bombs, which he intends to steal during a training exercise in the Bahamas. He sends Spectre operative Count Lipa to investigate, along with Fiona Volpe, another Spectre operative. Meanwhile, James Bond is relaxing when he almost gets assassinated. Just another Tuesday, huh? Next, Bond goes back to London and is targeted by Lipe, but Volpe gets him before he can make a move. I guess Spectre has a ruthless employment policy. Not long after, all 00 agents are put on alert when Spectre threatens that a major city in the US or UK will be destroyed unless they're paid £100 million within a week. At MI6, M sends Bond to the Bahamas to meet the sister of a dead pilot, whom Spectre killed. In the Bahamas, Bond meets Domino, the sister, who he learns is also banging Largo. When he sees them together at a casino, Bond and Largo are both lying low under secret identities and pretend not to know each other. Later, Bond meets with Felix Leiter, another agent named Paula Kaplan, and Q, who comes in clutch with the loadout. This time, an underwater infrared camera and breathing device. How does he always know exactly what Bond will need? That night, Bond investigates Largo's ship, where he notices a mysterious hatch leading underwater. Next, Bond visits Largo at his estate and discovers that Paula has been abducted and committed suicide instead of talking. Volpe catches up with Bond and they slow dance. A henchman tries to shoot Bond through a window, but 007 ruthlessly puts her in the bullet's path. Later, Bond and Leiter head underwater and find the bombs. On shore, Bond meets with Domino and tells her that Largo killed her brother. They both set out for Largo's ship. She gets captured, and Bond impersonates one of Largo's men and discovers where Spectre intends to move the bombs. Bond and Leiter contact the US Coast Guard and US Navy, who show up and get into an underwater spy battle with Largo's men. Bond goes after Largo on the ship, the Disco Volante, which shreds its rear half to become extra fast. Bond reaches the controls and sends the ship out of control while he takes on Largo's men. Bond and Largo have a showdown. Largo gains the upper hand and is about to shoot Bond when he's speared in the stomach by Domino. She was secretly freed by one of Largo's crew. Damn! These Spectre guys have no loyalty! Bond and Domino escape the Disco Volante seconds before it crashes, and presumably, they then look for an empty bed. The next film, You Only Live Twice, was supposed to be Connery's last. Keyword here is supposed to, but we'll get into that later. The entry opens in space. A NASA aircraft is hijacked from orbit by an unidentified spaceship. World leaders meet in the United States, accusing the Soviet Union, but the British suspect the Japanese government may be involved, considering the hijacked ship landed near Japan. Where is Bond during all of this intergalactic drama?
Why do Chinese girls taste different from all other girls?
Whoa, that's problematic. He's almost assassinated yet again, but manages to kill the bad guy and lead us into another seriously stylish theme song. Later, we witness a burial at sea, with the deceased being none other than James Bond. But, you know, he's just faking it to go undercover. Bond is recovered on the ocean floor and taken to a submarine, where he gets the rundown on the spaceship incident from M. Next, Bond heads to Japan to check out a sumo tournament. He meets a Japanese Secret Service agent, Aki, who takes him to an MI6 agent named Deco Henderson. Henderson claims to have evidence about the spaceship, but he is killed before he can talk. Bond takes out the assassin, wears his his clothes as a disguise and gets in the hitman's getaway car. He's taken to Osato Chemicals. Bond takes out the driver and breaks into the office safe of the company president, Mr. Osato, where he finds secret documents. Security catches on and chases Bond, but he's rescued by Aki, who pulls up in a sick car. He tries to ask her what's going on, but she won't say. She stops the car and runs away to a subway station. Bond chases her, but falls through a trap door leading to the head of Japan's Secret Service, a man known as Tiger Tanaka. He reviews the documents Bond took and tells him that Osato Chemicals is buying liquid oxygen for rocket fuel. They also uncover a photo of a ship. Next, Bond goes back to Osato Chemicals, this time undercover as a potential buyer. He briefly meets with Osato, who isn't fooled. He orders his secretary, Helga Brandt, to kill Bond. It turns out that these two are Spectre agents. Wow, who could have seen that coming? Bond heads out and is met by assassins, but Aki rescues him again. They drive to Kobe, where the ship they saw in the photo earlier is docked. They investigate and find that the ship is transporting rocket fuel. The guards soon discover them, and Aki escapes while Bond is captured. He wakes up in Brandt's cabin. She interrogates Bond, then seduces him with his one weakness. No! Brandt flies Bond to Tokyo the next day, sabotages the plane with a flare, and dips the heck out of there. Bond manages to take the controls and land the plane before it blows up. Later, Bond meets with Q, who gives him this cool mini helicopter equipped with a rocket launcher. Bond flies over the area where the ship is docked, but gets attacked when he gets near a volcano. Helicopter battle time! Of course, 007 takes them all out. Back in space, a Soviet aircraft gets captured in orbit by another mysterious ship, ratcheting up the nuclear tensions between the US and Soviet Union. The ship lands in a volcano at a hidden base run by our old friend Blofeld. He meets with Osato, and Brandt chews them out for not killing Bond. Blofeld drops Brandt in a pool filled with piranhas. Boss of the year! Meanwhile, in Kyoto, Bond prepares to conduct a closer investigation of the island by training with Tiger Tanaka's ninjas. He takes on the disguise and goes undercover as a Japanese man. Oh lord, this one really wouldn't fly today. Bond meets Tanaka's student, Kissy Suzuki, who will be assuming the role of his wife. They head back to the island and discover a booby-trapped cave that leads to the volcano base. Bond infiltrates it while Kissy goes to alert the Japanese Secret Service. Bond discovers captured American and Soviet astronauts and sets them free. They help him steal a spacesuit to infiltrate the Spectre spacecraft Bird 1. But before he can, Blofeld sees Bond and has him arrested. Bird 1 launches, and Bond is taken into the control room where he finally meets Blofeld. And we get to see his ugly face at last.
I am Ernst Stavro Blofeld.
At the same time, Bird 1 closes in on another American ship, and the US gets ready to attack Russia. Simultaneously, Tanaka's ninjas try to attack the base, but get stopped at the gates. Bond manages to distract Blofeld and opens the gates, and then we get an absolutely epic battle of ninjas versus Spectre. Blofeld kills Osato and gets ready to take out Bond next, but Tanaka shows up and throws a shuriken, stopping Blofeld from firing. Bond gets to the control room and causes Bird 1 to self-destruct. War is averted, but on the base, Blofeld activates a self-destruct system and runs away. Bond, Tanaka, and the rest of the ninjas leave before a volcanic eruption destroys the base, and they are rescued outside. Only 2 years later, we get a new Bond, George Lazenby, in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. This entry was for years the most hated, but has recently been a bit of a cult hit. Lazenby's take was not accepted by fans, and he remains the only actor to have played Bond just once. It all starts with Bond saving a woman on a beach, but he gets intercepted by hitmen. He takes them out and makes a quip directly to the camera.
This never happened to the other fella.
Later, James Bond runs into the woman again at the casino, and she introduces herself as Tracy DiVincenzo. That night, Bond goes to her hotel, but he's attacked on arrival. Bond meets up with Tracy, who says she knew nothing about the attacker. Sure. The next morning, Bond is kidnapped by several men, including the one from last night. They take him to meet Marcange Draco, the head of an underground European crime network. Draco reveals that Tracy is his daughter and offers Bond £1 million to marry her. That would be quite a power couple. Bond says no, but agrees to keep dating her if Draco will help him track down Blofeld. Next, Bond goes back to MI6, where M tells him he can move on from hunting Blofeld. Bond gets mad and dictates a letter of resignation to Moneypenny, but she edits it into a leave of absence. Afterwards, Bond heads to Portugal for Draco's birthday party. Bond and Tracy begin a romance that takes up an extended portion of the runtime. Maybe that's why this Bond wasn't well received. Too much character development, not enough badassery. Eventually, Draco tells Bond about a law firm in Switzerland with ties to Blofeld. Bond breaks into their office and discovers that Blofeld is corresponding with Britain to attempt to legalize himself by claiming the title of a count. Bond assumes the identity of Blofeld's British contact and goes to meet Blofeld, who doesn't recognize him.
Good evening, Sir Hilary.
Good evening.
What? That's right. In Ian Fleming's original novel, this was the first time these two met, and this adaptation maintains book accuracy. There are a lot more plot holes like these throughout, but don't think about it too hard. That's in order. Anyways, Blofeld set up a research facility in the Swiss Alps, and Bond checks it out. He meets 12 young women who are patients there, later referred to by Blofeld as his angels of death. Later, Bond goes to the room of one of them named Ruby and observes. He discovers the women go into a hypnotic state while Blofeld implants subliminal audio instructions. They're being brainwashed to distribute biowarfare agents throughout the world. Next, Bond tries to trick Blofeld into leaving Switzerland so that MI6 can arrest him, but Blofeld refuses. Bond is eventually caught by Spectre henchwoman Irma Bunt. Bond is taken captive, but escapes by skiing down the mountain while pursued by Blofeld's men. At the same time, the Angels of Death are taken off the mountain by Bunt. Bond recovers in a village, where he's found by Tracy, but it isn't long before Spectre shows up there too. The couple escapes by luring the crooks into a stock car race. A blizzard begins to pick up, and Bond and Tracy are forced into a remote barn, where Bond confesses his love to Tracy and proposes.
I love you. Will you marry me?
I got one thing to say here. Shocking. The next morning, Blofeld's men catch up and Bond and Tracy set back out, but Blofeld sets off an avalanche, leading to Tracy's capture. Bond gets buried but manages to dig himself out. Bond returns to London, where M tells him that Blofeld intends to hold the world ransom by threatening to destroy its agriculture using the Angels of Death. Blofeld wants a pardon and his count title. M tells Bond that the British government is going along with it and forbids Bond from rescuing Tracy. Bond says whatever, but immediately contacts Draco. Bond, Draco, and his men head to Blofeld's base, and a battle ensues. The facility is destroyed, and Bond chases Blofeld down the mountain in a bobsled, which sounds ridiculous, but it's actually a pretty cool scene. Blofeld ends up colliding with a tree and is taken out. Sometime later, Bond and Tracy get married and drive off in Bond's Aston Martin. Bond pulls over to remove flowers from the car when, boom, Blofeld pulls a drive-by and Tracy is killed. That's it. Movie over, with an insanely tragic twist. Bond isn't allowed to settle down. Compared to the Connery film, this one was a lot more grounded and not what audiences wanted at the time. So, the production company said Lazenby bye to Lazenby and brought back the one and only Sean Connery. The next movie Diamonds Are Forever opens up with Bond hunting down Blofeld. After some globe-trotting, he infiltrates his old family's facility. Bond thinks he has the drop on Blofeld, but it turns out to be just a body double. The real Blofeld shows, and after a fight, Bond kills his nemesis once and for all. And we segue right into another iconic title sequence and theme song. Alright, now that we've got that thread tied up, two assassins, Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd, are killing people for diamonds. At MI6 headquarters, M tells Bond that South African diamonds are being stockpiled to manipulate the prices. Bond is sent to uncover the smuggling ring. Next, Bond travels to Amsterdam, where he murders a smuggler and assumes his identity. He meets a contact, Tiffany Case. From there, they head to Los Angeles, hiding the diamonds inside the real smuggler's corpse. I know he's literally licensed to do this, but he's getting a little too casual about killing for my liking. At the airport, Bond meets our old CIA friend Felix Leiter, and they all go to their real destination, Las Vegas. Once there, the smuggler's body is delivered to a funeral home where he gets cremated and the diamonds are retrieved. The funeral home owner, Morton Slumber, double-crosses Bond. Wint and Kidd knock 007 out, shove him into a coffin, and leave him to be cremated alive.
Very moving.
But in the last possible second, he gets rescued by another smuggling operative, Shady Tree, who saves Bond when he discovers that the diamonds in the smuggler's body were fake. Bond, still acting as the smuggler, says he won't give the real diamonds until he gets real cash. Next, Bond tails Shady Tree to a casino, the White House, where Tree works as a stand-up comedian. Outside of Bond's view, Tree is killed by Wint and Kidd, who think the diamonds from earlier are real. Bond heads to Old Reliable, the craps table. He meets a woman with another ridiculous Bond girl name, Plenty O'Toole. Of course, they get along really well, if you know what I mean, but it isn't long until Slumber's henchmen ambush them, tossing O'Toole out the window.
Can't do this to me! Stop that! I've got friends in this town!
Bond takes him out and meets back up with Tiffany. He instructs her on where to get the real diamonds that the CIA is supplying. He picks Bond up to see the diamond exchange, and the diamonds are given to White's casino manager, Bert Saxby, who takes them to another contact, this time a scientist. They trail him to a remote lab, owned by White, where a satellite is being built using the diamonds. You know the drill. Bond sees a lab, he infiltrates it. Of course, he gets caught, but Bond hops in a moon buggy to get away. He then fights his way back to Tiffany. Sometime later, Bond climbs to the White House's top floor to confront Willard White, the casino's owner. But instead, he meets Blofeld times 2. Turns out they were giving orders as White using a voice changer. Bond isn't sure which Blofeld to kill, so he kicks the cat and shoots the Blofeld that the cat jumps to. I guess you really can die twice. Bond spares the other because he needs to find out the full story here. Bond leaves on an elevator but gets intercepted by Wint and Kidd. They gas Bond and take him to the pipeline to die, but you can't stop Agent 007. He short-circuits the welding machine that seals him in. Once he's free, Bond contacts the CIA. He uses a voice changer and poses as Saxby, the casino manager. He calls Blofeld and receives intel to head to White's residence. Bond storms White's desert home and takes out some henchmen before finally finding the real White. Meanwhile, Blofeld kidnaps Tiffany. That ain't good. White and Bond team up to go back to the lab. Bond discovers that Blofeld used the real diamonds to create a laser satellite. He wants to use the satellite to take control of nuclear weapons worldwide, then ransom them back. White discovers intel that indicates an oil rig off the coast of Mexico is Blofeld's main base. Bond communicates his findings to the CIA, and Felix Leiter leads a helicopter attack on the rig. Blofeld tries to escape in a sub, but Bond gains control of the crane used to launch it and swings it around, destroying the satellite room and base. With that out of the way, Bond and Tiffany take a cruise to England, but they get some seriously bad room service from Wint and Kid, who serve a time bomb cake. Hey! I wanted chocolate! But Bond catches on and sets Kid on fire, causing him to jump off the boat. Next, Bond throws Wint overboard while he holds the bomb, which blows up. The entry then ends with the couple watching Blofeld's disabled satellite in the sky. Alrighty then, that concludes Sean Connery's epic run as Bond. But he'll never ever play him again, right? 2 years later came the debut of a new Bond, Roger Moore. He has the longest tenure as Bond and plays it with more over-the-top humor. Let's get into Live and Let Die. 3 MI6 agents are killed simultaneously under mysterious circumstances in different cities. James Bond is a little busy with another lady when he receives a visit from M and Moneypenny. They brief Bond on the murders and send him to New York to investigate. Bond arrives, and his driver is assassinated by a henchman named Whisper. Bond almost dies in the crash, but come on, you can't kill Bond yet. Bond calls Felix and gets the assassin's license plate and goes to Harlem, where he meets Mr. Big, a mob boss who runs a chain of restaurants. Also present in New York is Dr. Kananga, a dictator of the island nation San Monique. Big sends Bond into an alley to be executed, but he's saved just in time by the CIA. On Bond's way out of New York, he meets Solitaire, a tarot reader who has voodoo powers. Hey, gotta keep things fresh somehow, I suppose. Next, Bond flies to San Monique, where he's almost assassinated by a snake in his hotel. Later, he meets Rosie Carver, a CIA agent, and Coral Jr., son of Coral from Dr. No. He takes them near Solitaire's home, and it isn't long until Bond suspects Rosie of being a double agent. She tries to escape, but is killed remotely by Kananga. Next, Bond meets with Solitaire and stacks a deck of tarot cards to seduce her. That night, Solitaire loses her virginity and her voodoo powers along with it. She agrees to cooperate with Bond to avoid Kananga's wrath. The next day, Bond and Solitaire find poppy fields that Kananga is maintaining secretly. Next, Bond and Solitaire leave the island and head to New Orleans. Bond is quickly captured by Mr. Big. No, wait, that's Kananga in disguise. He reveals a very Scooby-Doo-esque scheme where he uses a voodoo priest, Baron Samedi, to scare the locals to cover up his heroin production. Kananga plans on impersonating Mr. Big to distribute heroin to his restaurants to get the maximum number of people hooked. Kananga turns Solitaire over to Baron Samedi. Bond doesn't fare much better, as he's sent to be eaten by crocodiles by Kananga's henchmen, a one-armed freak named Teehee and a tweed-wearing classy guy, Adam. In a completely ridiculous escape, Bond runs across the crocs back to freedom. A real stuntman actually did that using live crocs. Insane! Next, Bond sets the drug laboratory on fire, then steals a speedboat while Kananga's men chase him. It's a big old chase that results in Bond killing Adam in a crash. It also gets the attention of Sheriff J.W. Pepper, who we'll see again later on. Later, Bond and Coral Jr. return to San Monique. They set up explosives throughout the fields. Bond finds Solitaire right when he's about to be sacrificed. The fields blow up and Bond gets into a fight with Samedi, causing him to fall into a coffin of venomous snakes. Bond and Solitaire run underground into Kananga's lair, but the dictator captures them both and tries to feed them to sharks. Jesus, the animals are eaten good in this movie! But Bond uses a hidden blade from his watch to escape. In one of the craziest villain deaths, Bond forces Kananga to swallow a compressed gas pellet, and he freaking blows up. Once the dust settles, Felix Leiter sets Bond and Solitaire up on a train back to New York, but they have a stowaway, Teehee. Bond cuts the wires from his prosthetic arm and throws him off of the train. All seems well, but inexplicably, Samedi is riding the front of the train. What? Yeah, it doesn't make sense. Don't think too hard, we're in the Roger Moore era. Oh look, hey, another movie! Up next is one of the craziest villains in The Man with the Golden Gun. The cold open starts with an American, Rodney, visiting an estate to try and collect a bounty on the famous hitman Francisco Scaramanga. He proceeds through the estate, and it gets weird real fast. There's mannequins, mirrors, and other tricks. Scaramanga picks up the golden gun and kills Rodney. Over in London, MI6 gets mailed a gold bullet with 007 carved on it. MI6 thinks it could be Scaramanga, but no one knows what he looks like besides his defining trait of having 3 nipples. What is he, a cow? Scaramanga? M tells Bond to drop his current mission and lie low for a bit. Of course, Bond doesn't listen and sets out to find Scaramanga himself. The trail leads to Hong Kong, where he confronts a smuggler, Andrea Anders, who happens to be Scaramanga's girlfriend. Andrea tells Bond to check out the Bottoms Up Club, where Scaramanga just killed someone whom Bond was investigating previously. Bond arrives, pulls out his gun, and is arrested by Hong Kong police immediately. But instead of going to a jail cell, he's brought to a boat to meet with M and Q. Here, Bond instructs Q to create one of the weirdest gadgets of all time, an artificial third nipple so he can impersonate Scaramanga. Hey, we're sure this isn't a fetish, right? Okay. Bond heads back to Bangkok to meet Hai Fat, an entrepreneur suspected of conspiring with Scaramanga, although they've never met. Bond flashes his 3 nipples and gains Hai Fat's trust. Bond is invited to dinner, but what he doesn't know is that the real Scaramanga is already at Fat's estate. Bond gets captured and taken to Fat's martial arts school, where students duel to the death. Bond gets in a kung fu fight, but is saved when the head of Hong Kong police and his nieces show up. Once he's safe, Bond is sent away on a boat with an assistant named Mary Goodnight. Meanwhile, Scaramanga uses his golden gun to kill Fat and take control of his criminal enterprise. That night, Anders crashes into Bond's hotel room. She tells him that she mailed the bullet to London. Anders wants 007 to kill Scaramanga, and in exchange, she'll give him the Solace agitator, a device that can harness solar energy. The murdered man outside the club was carrying it. The next day, Bond goes to meet her again, but finds her sitting dead in a crowd. Bond finally meets Scaramanga, who introduces himself, and Bond finds the Solex on the floor, which fell out of Anders's purse. Later, Bond gets the Solex to the Hong Kong police, who gives it to Goodnight for transport. Goodnight follows Knick-Knack, Scaramanga's dwarf assistant, but gets caught and abducted. Bond escapes down the river and encounters the Southern Sheriff from the last movie, J.W. Pepper. Later, Bond hijacks a car that Pepper is test driving and chases Scaramanga, who escapes when his car turns into a plane. Bond gets a plane hookup from MI6 and follows Goodnight's homing beacon to Scaramanga's island. Scaramanga gives Bond a tour and uses his new solar power energy beam to blow up Bond's plane. They dine together, and Scaramanga suggests the main attraction, a pistol duel on the beach. Knick-Knack sets it up and both men get into position. Bond turns around to shoot, but Scaramanga is gone. Knick-Knack leads Bond through Scaramanga's manor to the weird rooms we saw in the intro. Bond gets the drop on Scaramanga by posing as a mannequin and straight up murks him. Scaramanga drops the iconic golden gun. Meanwhile, Goodnight manages to kill one of Scaramanga's henchmen. He falls into a liquid helium vat that causes the plant to become unstable. Bond and Goodnight escape in Scaramanga's old ship. Knick-Knack appears for revenge, but Bond traps him in a suitcase and throws him overboard. Bond gets with Goodnight, but the final shot of the film is Knick-Knack in a lobster net attached to the ship. He won't return, but James Bond will in The Spy Who Loved Me. This one starts with Bond on a holiday in Austria doing his usual Bond stuff. You know what I mean. When he gets word of a new mission, Bond heads to the briefing but gets ambushed and is pursued down the mountain by Soviet agents. He kills a Russian named Sergei Barsov, who will become important later. 007 jumps off a cliff in one of the most impressive stunts of the series. Bond is brought by helicopter to a boat where he meets M and the head of the British Royal Navy. They tell him that 2 missile-loaded subs, one US and one UK, have gone missing. Luckily, they have a lead. Plans for an advanced submarine tracking system are on the black market via a microfilm. With that intel, Bond heads to Egypt and investigates the pyramids when his party is crashed by Major Anya Amasova, a KGB agent known as Triple X. She sends her men after him. He takes them out, but instead of attacking her, he walks away like a G. She's definitely a little bit impressed. Later, at a club in Cairo, he officially meets Anya, and there's some dangerous flirtation right away. She knows all kinds of details from Bond's life, including his doomed marriage to Tracy in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Oh yeah, her, okay. They meet with the man selling the microfilm, but before the bidding can start, he's summoned away for a call. It was all a ruse to set him up for assassination at the hands, or should I say teeth, of Jaws. One of Bond's most famous big bads who has lethal metal teeth. Jaws takes the microfilm. Bond and Amasova encounter each other across Europe, separately searching for the microfilm. They try to outdo each other, but Jaws attacks Anya on a train. Bond shocks his teeth and throws him off. Bond and Amasova spend a night together. They end up teaming up on the mission. Bond can turn anyone good, as long as they're absolutely gorgeous, I guess. Bond poses as a marine biologist and Anya as his wife. Together, they visit the base of their prime suspect, Carl Stromberg. They discover that Stromberg launched a mysterious new kind of tanker called a Leopardus 9 months previously. They leave and are chased by assassins and Jaws. Wait, yes, I know, he was thrown out of a train. I keep saying, no questions. Good, but Bond has a way out. That's right, his car can convert to a submarine. I told you, these gadgets were crazy! Next, Bond and Anya head to Stromberg's underwater base, Atlantis. They realize he controls the submarine tracking system. It's not long before they're attacked again by Stromberg's mini-subs, but they get out in time. Once on shore, Bond and Anya plot their next moves, when he lets it slip that he was in Austria right around the time her husband was killed. That's right, Sergei Barsov, one of the agents on skis, was Anya's husband. She's pissed and tells Bond that he's dead as soon as the mission concludes. Later, Bond and Anya board a US sub to check out Leopardus, but their vessel gets captured instead. Stromberg explains his super genius plan. He's gonna launch missiles from the opposing country's subs to hit population centers and trigger a nuclear war. Stromberg wants to hide out in Atlantis and birth a new underwater civilization. Okay, Aquaman, sure. He takes Amasova to Atlantis. Bond escapes and frees the captured sailors. They team up and fight the Leopardus crew. They reach the control room, but it's too late. The missiles are going out. Bond uses the controls to trick the submarines into firing the nukes at each other, destroying them and the Liparis. Bond and the other sailors escape on the American sub. Later, the Americans intend to destroy Atlantis, but Bond wants to rescue Amasova first, because the babes always come first. He sneaks in and shoots Stromberg, but that metal-toothed monster Jaws is still alive. Bond picks him up with a magnet by the teeth and very fittingly drops him into a shark tank. Bond and Anya escape in a pod just as Atlantis gets blown up. Anya steals Bond's gun and aims, but changes her mind and they hook up instead. Suddenly, we cut to Jaws! He is unstoppable. And spoiler alert, this isn't the last we're gonna see of him. The Royal Navy, including Q, comes by to save them and witness the escapades. How many times are they gonna walk in on this guy? Jeez. The stories in this series have been getting more and more ridiculous, and the indulgence hits a peak in 1979's Moonraker. Seen as a competition to Star Wars, this is remembered as the space one. It opens with the Moonraker space shuttle being hijacked while being carried into the atmosphere. M goes to call Bond, but he's currently hooking up with a girl on a plane, a girl who happens to be a double agent. Assassins, including Jaws, try to kill Bond, but he spectacularly skydives and lands in a circus tent. And we've just gotten started. Bond heads off to California to investigate the space plane manufacturing complex of Drax Industries. Bond meets Hugo Drax, the weirdo owner of Drax Industries, and his henchman, Chang. Also at Drax Estate, he meets, and try not to roll your eyes here, Dr. Holly Goodhead, an astronaut. Anyway, Bond is almost taken out in a zero-gravity simulator, but gets released by Goodhead, and they spend the night together after. Yay. Bond's search leads him to Venice, where he observes Goodhead sneaking around a glass factory, but he gets spotted by Drax's men and gets into a chase. He comes back to the factory that night and finds a secret biological lab that possesses a nerve gas deadly to humans, but harmless to all other life. Chang locates Bond and attacks, but Bond throws him through a stained glass window. Bond finds evidence that Drax is going to Rio. He picks up Goodhead along the way back to England because, of course, it turns out she's an undercover CIA agent. At MI6, M allows Bond to continue the investigation to Rio if he pretends he's on leave. During Rio's Carnival celebration, Bond investigates a Drax facility, but his contact is attacked by Jaws. Later, Jaws tries to kill Bond and Goodhead on cable cars, but 007 gets the upper hand. Jaws' cable car crashes, but he's rescued by Dolly, a woman that Jaws then falls in love with. I hope they're not French kissing. Goodhead is eventually captured by Drax, and Bond's search leads him to the Amazon rainforest, the location of a plant that produces the toxin Drax is harvesting. Bond comes under attack from Drax's forces before eventually locating his base, where he's captured. Bond and Goodhead are imprisoned under the launch platform and escape as Moonraker 5 takes off. They disguise themselves as pilots and board Moonraker 6. On Drax's space station in space, Bond and Goodhead disable the radar jamming cloaking device, tipping off the US military, who send space marines that launch an assault on Drax's space station. In space, Jaws captures Bond and Goodhead, and Drax reveals his plan to destroy humanity with the nerve gas to repopulate the Earth using his hand-selected populace. Okay. Bond gets Drax to admit that Jaws wouldn't be a part of this master race, and Jaws switches sides. He goes buck wild on Drax's guards, and Bond is freed. Time for a freaking laser gun battle. Drax's forces are defeated by Bond, Space Marines, and Jaws. The station blows up, and Bond ejects Drax into the vacuum of space. Next, Bond and Goodhead stop the gas devices from going to Earth. Meanwhile, Jaws and Dolly make it out in an escape pod. Bond's superiors tune in to a video feed of Moonraker 5 to see Bond and Goodhead making love in 0 Gs. I'm starting to think Bond likes being caught. Bond gets brought back down to Earth in the slightly less over-the-top for your eyes only. Let's get into it. Bond visits the grave of Tracy. He gets into a helicopter out of there, but he has no idea there is an old friend of his piloting it via remote control. Blofeld. He controls it remotely, but Bond manages to take back the controls. Bond finds Blofeld, picks him up, and drops him down a chimney. Hey, that's not Santa Claus. Alright, time for the mission. A British ship, which houses a missile command system called ATAC, collides with an underwater mine and sinks. The British send an archaeologist, Sir Timothy Havelock, to find it. Havelock gets murdered by a hitman, Hector Gonzalez, in front of his daughter, Melina. Melina wants revenge. Meanwhile, General Gogol, commander of the KGB, wants to find this ship too. Back in England, Bond is ordered to retrieve the ATAC before the Soviets can. He's sent to Spain to learn who hired Gonzalez. While investigating Gonzalez's place, Bond is captured by his men, but escapes as a crossbow bolt from an unseen assassin kills Gonzalez. Turns out it was Melina who meets Bond and they escape together. Bond heads back to London, where Q uses an early computer to find the man paying off Gonzalez, Emile Leopold Locke, an assassin with a long criminal history. Bond goes to Italy to scope out Locke's place. There, Bond meets Luigi Ferrera, an Italian Secret Service agent, and Greek businessman Aristotle Christatos. He reveals that Locke is employed by Milos Colombo. Milos is a major threat, known as the White Dove in the Greek underworld. Later, Bond goes with the Christanos' associate, figure skater BB Doll, to a skating event, and he gets attacked by 3 men in ice hockey gear. Is that Wayne Gretzky? Anyways, Bond heads back to his car to find Ferrera dead, with a pin depicting a dove in his hand. Bond goes to find Colombo. Later, at a casino, Bond asks around for intel on Colombo, while Colombo's men secretly surveil him. Bond observes Colombo getting into a fight with his mistress, Countess Lisi von Schlaff. Bond takes her away, and they spend the night together. The next day, they get attacked on the beach. Lisi gets killed by Locke, and Bond is captured by Colombo's men. Colombo tells him that Locke was actually hired by Bond's Greek contact, who's a secret KGB agent. Colombo takes Bond on a raid of one of Christatos' opium facilities. During this attack, Bond uncovers mines similar to the one that sank the British ship, suggesting it was an attack and not an accident. The base gets destroyed while Bond chases Locke and kills him by shoving his car off of a cliff. Later, Bond meets up with Melina. They dive to the ship's ruins to retrieve the ATAC, but Christatos is waiting for them on the surface. He leaves with the ATAC. Bond and Melina are dragged behind the ship in hopes that sharks will eat them. Bond manages to detach them, and they're presumed dead. Later, Bond hears Melina's parrot say the phrase ATAC to St. Cyril's, and he knows where he's got to go. Bond and Melina team up with Colombo's men and break into St. Cyril's, an abandoned monastery on a mountain. Bond scales a cliff and paves the way for the rest of the crew to come up. Bond retrieves the ATAC system. Melina wants to kill Christatos, but Bond thinks he should be arrested. Christatos moves to kill Bond with a hidden knife, but Colombo has a knife of his own. He takes Christatos out. In that moment, Gogol arrives by helicopter to take the ATAC, but Bond throws it off the freaking cliff. Gogol isn't too upset. This guarantees peace between the superpowers, for now. Bond and Melina go back to the yacht, where she shows him something.
For your eyes only, darling.
She's talking about her boobs. Get it? Yeah. Next, the most insanely titled movie, not out of only the Bond films, but maybe ever, Octopussy. I can't believe I just said that. Fun fact, the same year of its release came Sean Connery's return as Bond in Never Say Never Again. We're not gonna recap it because it's an unofficial entry and its plot is kind of a rehash of Thunderball. Plus, Connery was elderly and nobody wanted double old 7. Alright, let's get back to Octopussy. After an action-packed cold open that finds Bond escaping in a jet from a heat-seeking missile, we check in on Agent 009. Yes, the clown. He gets wounded by twin assassins Mishka and Grishka in East Berlin. 009, who's disguised as a clown, carries a fake Fabergé egg. He crashes into the British ambassador's house and dies. MI6 thinks the Soviets are behind this and sends Bond to an auction where the real Fabergé egg is going up. Bond switches a decoy for the real one and engages in a bidding war with Kamal Khan, an exiled Afghan prince. Khan ends up paying £500,000 for the fake egg. Bond knows this is the suspect. Later, M sends 007 to India to track Khan. In India, Bond plays backgammon with Khan and notices he's using a loaded dice. Bond switches the dice, causing Khan to lose even more money. He gets pissed and Bond flees. Bond also meets up with his MI6 contact Vijay. Together, they run from Khan's bodyguard Govinda in a taxi. Later, Magda, Khan's associate, seduces Bond, but Bond is into her. She knocks him out and takes the real egg, but it was already filled with surveillance tech from Q. Bond gets taken to Khan's palace and overhears a meeting between Khan and General Orlov from the KGB. It's revealed that Orlov is supplying real diamonds in exchange for fakes that Khan is selling, with the exchange taking place at a circus. Bond escapes and is hunted by Khan, but manages to get away. Next, Bond investigates the knockoff supplier. His search leads him to an island palace owned by Octopussy. I wonder if that's a family name. She also leads the Octopus cult, women who live on Octopussy's island and are loyal to her. Octopussy reveals Bond had her father arrested for treason, but it's all good. She invites Bond to stay with her, and they hook up. The next night, Khan's assassins break into the palace, but Bond and Octopussy defeat them. Meanwhile, in Moscow, our old friend General Gogol plans to make a move on Orlov. The circus is about to start. Bond infiltrates the event and discovers that Orlov replaced the jewels with a nuclear warhead, which is set to blow up a US Air Force base, and would likely trigger a lethal blame game between the US, UK, and Russia. The bomb is headed to a Soviet base via circus train. Bond chases in a car along the train tracks and boards the train. Orlov goes after the train too, but is killed by border guards in the process. Once on board, Bond kills Mishka and Grishka. He's thrown off the train and eventually steals a car to reach the base. To infiltrate the facility, Bond wears his most ridiculous guise yet, a clown. Yes, Roger Moore's Bond is an absolute clown. Bond finds Octopussy and tells her about Khan's nuke scheme. She helps Bond find the bomb, which he defuses just in time. This isn't good for Khan. He returns to his palace, but Octopussy's men are coming. Bond arrives in a hot air balloon with the Union Jack. Classic. Her men and Bond storm the grounds. Octopussy tries to kill Khan and gets captured by Govinda. Khan flees onto a plane with Octopussy as a hostage, but Bond holds onto the fuselage. He boards the plane and gets into a fight with Govinda, causing the henchman to fall off. Bond and Octopussy jump off the plane just as it crashes, killing Khan. Later, M meets with Gogol, and they decide to sweep this under the rug for the good of the world. Next up, A View to a Kill. This is Roger Moore's last Bond outing, and to be honest, he was really showing his age. It was time. We start with Bond on a mission in Siberia to recover the body of a deceased Agent 003, who was carrying a Soviet microchip. It leads to another ski chase, which turns into a snowboard chase as Bond loses a ski. Alright, opening title time. For how uneven this movie is, Duran Duran's theme song is seriously catchy. At MI6, Q analyzes the recovered microchip. It was created by Zorin Industries, led by Max Zorin. Bond visits a horse race to spy on Zorin. There, he meets Sir Godfrey Tibet, a horse trainer and MI6 agent. He thinks Zorin's horses are using drugs to win, although they always test negative. Later that month, Bond and Tibet travel to Zorin's estate for a horse sale. Bond notices Zorin writing checks to a beautiful woman. Interesting. That night, Bond and Tibet infiltrate Zorin's secret lab, and it turns out he's implanting horses with an adrenaline-releasing device. Later, Mayday, Zorin's main assassin, kills Tibet when he hides out in a car wash. They try to kill Bond in a sunken car next, but he escapes by breathing in air from one of the tires. Meanwhile, General Gogol meets with Zorin and gets mad at him for trying to kill Bond unauthorized. Zorin says screw Mother Russia, and Mayday assaults one of Gogol's men.
No one ever leaves the KGB.
Later, Zorin unveils his plan to a group of investors. He wants to destroy Silicon Valley and give them all a monopoly over microchip production. So we've just moved on from the horses? Bond is set in San Francisco to meet with Chuck Lee of the CIA. Was Felix Leiter busy or something? Anyways, Lee reveals that Zorin isn't only giving his horses roids, he's on them too. Next, Bond checks out an oil rig owned by Zorin and discovers KGB agent Paula Ivanova placing explosives on the rig. They get discovered, Ivanova and Bond escape, and the bombs are disarmed. The next day, Bond meets Stacy Sutton, a woman we saw Zorin write a check to earlier. It turns out Zorin is trying to buy her family's oil business. Bond and Stacy go to City Hall to check out Zorin's submitted plans, but Zorin intercepts them on the way. Zorin delivers them to the mayor, kills this poor mayor, and tries to frame Bond. He sets fire to the building, but Bond and Sutton escape. Next, they head to a silicon mine owned by Zorin. Bond and Stacy discover his plan. Zorin will detonate a series of underground explosions to trigger earthquakes that'll destroy Silicon Valley and its industries. The plan begins with the fire blast going off, and the mine gets flooded. Stacy escapes, and Bond encounters Mayday. They fight, but once she realizes that Zorin abandoned her, she helps Bond get rid of the second bomb. Mayday sacrifices herself by riding a cart away, which contains the bomb. Stacy is discovered by Zorin and taken hostage on his blimp, while Bond grabs hold of the blimp's rope. Zorin tries to lose him, but Bond ties the airship to the Golden Gate Bridge. Bond fights Zorin on the bridge until Bond knocks him off. One of Zorin's men tries to kill Bond with dynamite but Bond cuts the blimp free, which causes him to drop the lit stick. The blimp blows up Hindenburg style. Sometime later, Gogol wants to award Bond a medal for beating Zorin, but Bond is a little busy. Yeah, with Moore's advanced age, that's a little bit creepy. After the Moore era insanity, this series needed to get back to basics. The Living Daylights brought a brand new Bond, played by Timothy Dalton. Though he only held the role for 2 films, he has a pretty solid portrayal that many said was the closest to the character as written by Ian Fleming. Dalton also leans into the darkness a bit more, which we'll see developed in the Craig era. It starts when Bond, along with agents 004 and 002, are training. An assassin kills 004 by cutting his climbing rope as he scales a mountain. Bond catches the assassin getting away and jumps onto his car. The car drives off a cliff, explodes, and Bond parachutes out and lands on a tourist's boat. As you always do when you crash onto someone's boat, he introduces himself.
Bond, James Bond.
Much later, Bond visits M16 for his next mission. He's sent to assist KGB General Georgy Koskov in defecting to the West by providing him with sniper rifle cover. Bond travels to Czechoslovakia and gets into position at the escape spot, which is a symphony concert. Bond notices the cellist named Kara Milovi trying to snipe Koskov. He can tell she doesn't know what she's doing, so he shoots the rifle out of her hands instead of killing her. Bond meets with Koskov and smuggles him out through a pipeline. Later, Koskov tells M16 that the KGB is restarting their old intelligence unit Smrt Spionam, meaning death to spies. It isn't long before the KGB abducts Koskov from the safe house. Bond is sent to track down General Pushkin, the new head of the KGB, and kill him. Q hooks Bond up with a new gadget-filled Aston Martin, and Bond is on the case. Bond returns to Czechoslovakia to question Kara. He learns that Koskov's defection was faked and that he's dating Kara. Bond convinces Kara to accompany him to Vienna to continue the case. It isn't long until KGB officers show up, as Kara is under surveillance, leading to a chase where Bond self-destructs the Aston Martin and they flee down a snowy mountain, using Kara's cello case as a sled. Bond really does love his winter sports. In Vienna, Bond meets an M16 contact who tells him about Brad Whitaker, an arms dealer who has dealings with General Pushkin. After the meeting, Bond's contact gets bombed by Koskov's henchman, Nekros, who leaves another death to spies message. Next, Bond and Kara follow the trail to Morocco and find Pushkin, who denies any knowledge of death to spies. Pushkin reveals that Koskov is wanted by the KGB for embezzlement of government funds, so they decide to join forces. Koskov ordered Pushkin's death, so Bond fakes Pushkin's assassination, which causes Whitaker and Koskov to progress with their scheme. Meanwhile, Kara contacts Koskov, who tells her that Bond is really a KGB agent. Later, she drugs Bond's drink under Koskov's orders. Bond wakes up on a Soviet airbase in Afghanistan. Koskov betrays Kara and has her imprisoned next to him. Bond and Kara escape, fight off the guards, and free another prisoner who was sentenced to death, Kamran Shah, a local rebel leader. Bond finds evidence that Koskov is using old Soviet money to buy opium from the rebels, then using the profit from drug sales to buy weapons from Whitaker. Once off the base, Bond teams up with Shah's rebels and infiltrates the base. Bond plants a bomb on a plane carrying the opium supply, but he's compromised and has to seal himself inside. At the same time, the rebels attack the base on horses and battle the Soviets. Meanwhile, Kara drives a jeep onto the plane where Bond is hiding out, and it takes off, with Nekros jumping on board at the last second. Bond and Nekros get into a fight. Kara opens the cargo door, leading to Nekros getting sucked out along with all the opium. Bye-bye, bitch. Bond looks down to notice Shah in trouble with the Soviets. He drops the bomb onto a bridge, blowing it up to allow Shah and the rebels to escape. Bond and Kara exit the plane as it crashes. Seems like the movie's over, but there's still some loose ends to tie up. Bond teams up with Felix Leiter to infiltrate Whitaker's residence in Morocco. Bond and Whitaker have a showdown, with Bond using his keyfinder gadget to blow up a bust that crushes Whitaker. Meanwhile, Pushkin arrests Koskov and has his ass sent back to Moscow. Sometime later, Kara is back on stage playing the cello. Kamran Shah and his men attend the performance and meet General Gogol from the Moore era, who now serves as a diplomat. After the show, Bond meets Kara in her dressing room. That was a fun, classic Bond espionage adventure, but the next film plays with the formula quite a bit and is one of the darkest entries so far. License to Kill opens with Bond hanging out with Felix Leiter on their way to Leiter's wedding. However, they get directed by the DEA to help them on a mission to take down drug lord Franz Sanchez. No days off. Of course, there's a big battle which sets up the grittier feel of this film, and it ends fantastically with Bond and Leiter hooking Sanchez's plane to a helicopter. Bond and Felix parachute down just in time for the wedding. After the cold open, Sanchez is brought in by the DEA, but he bribes agent Ed Killefer to help him escape. When Sanchez is in transport, Killefer knocks out the driver and drives it into the ocean, where scuba divers wait for Sanchez. The wedding wraps up, and the happy couple gets ready for their first night together. Don't celebrate too soon. Sanchez's men, including henchman Dario, kidnap Leiter and murder his new wife. Leiter is taken to an aquarium and is slowly lowered into a shark tank by Sanchez. Felix recognizes Killian as a DEA agent too. Felix is mauled by sharks, and the crooks sadistically enjoy it. The next day, on Bond's way out, he hears news of Sanchez's escape. He heads to Felix's house to discover the corpse of his wife, still in her wedding gown. Bond meets up with his contact Sharky, and they start an investigation. It isn't long until they find a marine research center run by Milton Crest, who also owns the aquarium. Bond and Sharky sneak in and discover hidden cocaine, along with a sub to smuggle the goods. Bond's cover is blown, and it leads to some insane kills, like Bond throwing a man into a drawer full of maggots. Killefer shows up too, and Bond makes him into shark food. The next day, Bond continues the search when he's intercepted by MI6 and brought to M. Bond is assigned a mission in Istanbul, but he turns down and resigns. Revenge is more important. M says you cannot quit, you're fired, and revokes Bond's license to kill.
Effective immediately. Your license to kill is revoked.
Bond is supposed to go back to London, but escapes instead, now a rogue agent. Bond continues the investigation on a ship owned by Crest called Wavecrest. It's a messy mission, with Bond barely making it out alive, but he manages to dump the coke and steal a cool $5 million. Sharky, unfortunately, gets killed in the process. Back on shore, Bond attends a meeting with a DEA informant, Pam Bouvier, that was meant for Felix. Dario crashes the party. Bond and Bouvier fight him off and decide to work together. Meanwhile, at MI6, Moneypenny is devastated that Bond is gone. She decides to send Q to help. Bond and Bouvier travel to Isthmus and begin snooping around Sanchez's casino, but it isn't long before Sanchez is suspicious. Bond pretends to be an assassin for hire, but Sanchez isn't sure and takes his gun. Later at his hotel, Q secretly visits Bond and hooks him up with gadgets, including an exploding toothpaste tube. Don't get that one confused in the morning. He also gives Bond a rifle that will only fire for Bond. The next night, Bond makes his move. He blows out the casino windows and is about to take a shot when ninjas! It's the Hong Kong Narcotics Bureau. They question Bond at a secluded warehouse, but Sanchez's men crash the party. They find Bond captured and assume the cops tried to kill Sanchez. Bond finally gains Sanchez's trust. Now undercover as one of Sanchez's guys, Bond has Q and Bouvier help him plant the money on Crest's ship, which he recovered in the drug bust earlier. On board, Sanchez locks Crest in a decompression chamber, and his head freaking explodes. Later, Sanchez takes Bond to his base, which is disguised as a culty meditation institute. Bond learns the smuggling process. Coke is dissolved in gas, then sold as fuel to dealers in Asia. Also involved is the cult's leader, Joe Butcher, whom Bolivar visits in the meantime. Bond has seen enough and starts a fire that blows up the gasoline-infused Coke. He's captured by Sanchez and put on the conveyor belt leading to a grinder. Bouvier arrives just in time. She shoots Dario, setting Bond up to finish him off via grinder. Sanchez and his men escape in a large tanker convoy filled with his special gas, as the fire burns out of control. Bouvier and Bond catch up in a small crop duster plane. Bond disposes of the tankers one by one until only Sanchez remains. Bond and Sanchez fight on the back of the final tanker, which crashes. Sanchez, covered in gasoline, attacks Bond with a machete. Bond flashes his cigarette lighter, his best man's gift from Felix's wedding, and lights that sucker up. Sanchez runs to his tanker and everything explodes. Bouvier gets Bond out of there. Later, Bond gets a call from Felix telling him that M is impressed with his work and wants him back at MI6. I guess 007 gets to kill another day. Though both of his films were good, a third Dalton Bond movie got stalled due to a lengthy legal battle between production companies. Dalton didn't return, leaving Bond in an uncertain place. No one expected the next film to be one of the series' best. GoldenEye arrived in 1995. It's a real turning point in the series as the first post-Cold War entry, which drove so much of the conflict in previous films. Fortunately, EON Productions had an ace up its sleeve: the new Bond, Pierce Brosnan. Pierce ups the class and sass significantly, giving audiences essentially a new version of the Connery portrayal, updated for the 90s. This installment also has one of the greatest video game adaptations ever, GoldenEye 007 for the N64. The multiplayer still holds up today, and there are tons of cool gear from the series, like the Golden Gun. Hell, you can even throw Oddjob's hat. GoldenEye begins with a flashback to 1986, with Bond on a mission at a Soviet Union chemical lab. Brosnan Bond is introduced with an insane stunt, bungee jumping off a dam. He infiltrates the base and meets with his fellow agent, Alec Trevelyan. His codename is 006, and he is played by Ned Stark himself, Sean Bean, baby! This mission is compromised, and 006 is executed by General Orumov. I guess this movie follows the Sean Bean dies in everything rule. It's because his name doesn't rhyme when it should, you know? Bond escapes in a seriously death-defying sequence that ends with him escaping in a stolen plane. 9 years later, the Soviet Union is done, which, if you want to hear more about, go to history class. Bond is on a drive with a shrink assigned by MI6 to analyze him. He takes her on a drive that turns into an all-out street race with a mysterious Ferrari. Later, Bond goes to a casino where he meets the driver, Xenia Onatop. Bond plays Onatop in poker, leading to maybe the best delivery of the iconic catchphrase.
The name's Bond. James Bond.
You can tell Pierce just loves saying it. Bond learns from Miss Moneypenny via car radio that Onatop is part of a crime syndicate. That night, Onatop murders a military admiral, whom she's taken to bed by choking him with her legs. What a way to go! The next day, Onatop murders a few guys and hijacks an attack helicopter. Bond is too late. Onatop brings the chopper to General Orumov from the cold open. They demo their weapon, GoldenEye, which is a satellite that can fire a massive EMP, or electromagnetic pulse. They destroy the facility's personnel and get the heck out of there, but unknowingly leave a witness, Natalia Simonova. The EMP is so big that it shuts down MI6's computers. We get our first look at the new M, played by the acting legend Dame Judi Dench. M assigns Bond to investigate, and he notices a survivor, Natalia, on the surveillance tape. Bond immediately suspects Orumov. M is skeptical of Bond's methods and critiques him. It gets very meta.
Because I think you're a sexist, misogynist dinosaur, relic of the Cold War.
Regardless, she still puts him on the case. Next, Bond visits Q for a trap pen that can explode, a laser wristwatch, and a new BMW. Bond heads to St. Petersburg and meets with Jack Wade of the CIA. He informs Bond Bond of a former KGB agent, Valentin Zhukovsky, who's now a gangster. Bond visits Zhukovsky and gets him to agree to arrange another meeting with Janice, head of the mysterious syndicate that Onatopp belongs to. Later at his hotel, Onatopp visits him in a steam room, but for once, he doesn't fall for it and demands a ride to Janice. Onatopp brings Bond to a graveyard of Russian political leaders where he meets Janice, who's actually 006. He faked his death and defected to Russia. It turns out 006's parents were Russian and helped the Nazis during World War II. They tried to defect to England, but were instead sent to the Soviet Union. In shame, 006's father killed his mother, then himself. The 00 program really needs to work on their background checks. Bond pulls a gun on his former ally, but gets taken out by a tranquilizer. Bond wakes up in the stolen helicopter with Natalia in the back seat. He manages to eject them just as the helicopter explodes. They land and are immediately arrested. In captivity, Bond and Natalia meet with Dmitry Mishkin, the Russian Minister of Defense. Natalia tells them about Orumov's involvement in the GoldenEye weapon. She directs them to another survivor, Boris, who's assisting Orumov in developing another GoldenEye. Mishkin wants to move on this, but Orumov comes into the room and kills him, hoping to frame Bond. He captures Natalia and gets out of there. Bond escapes and ends up chasing Orumov in an old Soviet tank. Orumov reaches his armored train with Natalia and gets away. Bond puts his tank in the train's path and it crashes to a halt. Bond enters the train and gets the drop on 006 and Onatopp. Bond chooses to save Natalia instead, and he kills Orumov, but they get locked in the train, which is going to crash. They jump out as it explodes and make out on the track after. Next, Bond and Natalia go to Cuba, where they've traced Boris to. Their plane gets shot down, and Onatopp comes for them on a helicopter. She tries her leg squeeze move on Bond, but he hooks her to a helicopter that forces her spine to be snapped between two trees. Guess not all women can be redeemed. Damn! While flying over the area, the pair is shot down. Next, Bond and Natalia find a hidden base with an artificial lake, and it conceals a satellite dish. They split up with Bond setting explosives, while Natalia tries to shut the satellite down. Bond deliberately gets caught to further sabotage the facility. He gets brought to 006. Bond discovers that 006's plan is to use the GoldenEye to wipe out tech in the UK, plunging it into another Stone Age. Natalia gets captured next, just as she hacks into the satellite to make it fall into the atmosphere and burn itself up. She gets captured and brought to 006. Boris tries to crack her code and keeps nervously pressing the pen he confiscated from Bond. It arms the grenade inside, and Bond knocks it into a pool of chemicals, causing an explosion that allows them to escape. Bond and Natalia head to the satellite dish to disable the antenna. 006 shows. He and Bond get into a fight way high up in the air. 007 eventually knocks him off the dish and ends him. Damn! That is cold. Sean Bean always dies. The GoldenEye satellite burns up in the atmosphere, and Natalia takes over a helicopter to swoop Bond up right as the antenna explodes and destroys the base, crushing all inside, including 006. Bond and Natalia land in a meadow to finally get some alone time when they're intercepted by Wade and the CIA. Man, they ruin all the fun. From here on out, each of the Brosnan films get more and more ridiculous. The next entry, Tomorrow Never Dies, starts with 007 doing some recon on an arms dealer on the Russian border, when Royal Navy Admiral Roebuck fires a missile at the meeting before Bond can finish his mission. Bond fires 2 nuclear torpedoes and realizes an explosion here would not be good. He pilots the plane with the nukes away right as the missiles come in. Meanwhile, Elliot Carver, a media mogul, obtains an encoder from the arms deal. He intends to provoke war between China and the UK. His associate, Henry Gupta, uses the encoder to send a British ship into Chinese water. Then, Carver's stealth ship sinks it. He also takes out a Chinese jet, further fueling the conflict. Elsewhere, the British Minister of Defense gives M only 48 hours for her own investigation before he retaliates. M sends her main man, 007, to go look into Carver, as his media company, CMGN, released details on the assault before intelligence even knew about it. Bond is sent to Hamburg and immediately seduces Carver's wife, Paris, whom Bond used to date. She gives him intel on how to break into a CMGN printing factory. Bond sneaks in and steals a GPS encoder. He also meets a Chinese Secret Service agent, Wei Lin, while investigating a CMGN printing factory. She's seriously badass. Bond returns to the hotel room to find Paris dead. He's taken hostage, but uses a remote control car from Q to get away. Next, Bond heads to Okinawa, Japan and meets with his old friend Jack Wade. He sets Bond up with gear to halo jump out into the sea to check out the wreck, along with Wei Lin, who's investigating on behalf of China. They discover one of the ship's missiles is missing. They resurface but are captured and taken to the CMGN tower in Saigon. Carver sends a henchman to torture them. Bond and Wei Lin are handcuffed together, but they run and jump off of the roof, using a giant banner to safely fall to the ground. They hop on a motorcycle and get away. After some back and forth and a steamy shower, they team up. They receive intelligence outlining Carver's plan. He wants to destroy most of the Chinese government with the stolen missile, which will pave the way for a corrupt general to take over. The new government will negotiate a truce between Britain and China, whom Carver baited into war. This is all for Carver to get exclusive broadcasting rights in China. Couldn't he have just, bought some stocks? Anyway, Bond and Wei Lin locate Carver's stealth ship and begin planting explosives. However, Wei Lin gets captured. Bond, in turn, captures one of Carver's men, thinking he can trade, but Carver kills the henchman instead. That is cold. Bond uses a grenade, which begins a fight and makes the stealth ship vulnerable to radar. Wei Lin escapes to disable the engines, but gets captured again. Meanwhile, Bond gets into it with Carver and kills him with a giant drill attached to the ship. Bond goes to stop the warheads next, but gets attacked, and Wei Lin is thrown into the water, where she continues to sink due to her chains. Bond gets the upper hand by trapping the henchman in the missile-firing chamber. He saves Wei Lin as the missile blows up, which also destroys the ship. Bond saves Wei Lin, and they kiss. Only 2 years later came The World Is Not Enough. Bond is in Spain, meeting with a banker, Lachaise, who gives Bond ransom money to be paid out to a wealthy British businessman. Bond catches Lachaise by surprise by asking about the identity of an MI6 agent's assassin. His men attack, but Bond takes them out. Just as Lachaise is about to talk, his secretary throws a knife, killing him. Bond takes the money from the deal and gets out. Bond returns to MI6 headquarters and delivers the money, but it's a trap. It blows up the businessman and a hole through MI6. Bond sees the secretary from earlier in a boat and chases her in his Q-boat through the River Thames until she tries to board a hot air balloon on land. Bond offers to protect her, but she says no one can protect her and blows up the balloon, killing herself in the process. Damn, that's intense! Later, Bond is briefed by M on a suspect named Renard, who was shot by a 00 agent but didn't die. Instead, the bullet shredded part of his brain, giving him the ability to not feel any pain. Bond is assigned to protect the daughter of the targeted businessman, who was previously held hostage. He visits the Q unit for actor Desmond Llewellyn's last scene as Q. He's been Q since From Russia with Love. He introduces a successor, R.
If you're Q, does that make him R?
Although he takes the Q name in future installments. Bond flies to Azerbaijan, where the daughter Elektra is overseeing construction of an oil pipeline. She's hesitant to allow Bond to protect her, as MI6 blew up, no pun intended, the ransom deal. She takes Bond into the mountains, but they get attacked by hitmen on snowmobiles. Bond is able to stop them, but causes an avalanche, and he uses an inflatable shelter gadget to protect them. Later, Bond heads to a casino to meet with Zukovsky from GoldenEye. Zukovsky says Renard is former KGB. Later, Bond gets suspicious of Elektra as she starts gambling her money away on high-stakes card games. They still end up hooking up that night though. Bond sneaks out and kills one of Renard's associates to take his identity. Next, Bond boards a plane bound for a shuttered Soviet base in Kazakhstan. There, James Bond meets Dr. Christmas Jones, a nuclear physicist played by Denise Richards. I gotta say, a scientist this hot is the most unrealistic thing about the series so far. Anyways, she's helping the Russians dismantle the base. Later, Bond observes Renard stealing an active warhead. He captures Renard and interrogates him, but there's no point because the man doesn't feel any pain. A firefight ensues. Bond and Jones escape while Renard gets the warhead. Sometime later, Bond meets up with M and tells her that Elektra may have Stockholm Syndrome from her imprisonment with Renard. Next, Bond and Jones discover that the stolen bomb resurfaced at another pipeline, and they go to disarm it. But the bomb goes off. Bond and Jones escape, but are presumed dead. Back at the command post, Elektra comes clean to M. She killed her father as revenge for using her as bait to bring in Renard. She then imprisons M. Next, Bond locates Zukovsky at his caviar factory when they're attacked by Elektra's helicopters. Bond takes one out with a flare gun, and it's pretty freaking cool. The group heads to Istanbul next. They suspect that Renard is planning to insert stolen plutonium into a submarine's nuclear reactor, which would cause a meltdown that would destroy Istanbul and cut off a gas transport route. This would allow Elektra's pipeline to significantly increase in value. They head to where the sub is docked near the Maiden Tower, but one of Zukovsky's henchmen turns, knocks out Zukovsky, and apprehends Bond and Jones. Jones is taken aboard the sub, while Bond is taken to the tower. Elektra straps Bond into a garrote and tortures him. It's kinda hot, if you're into that. Zukovsky and his men arrive just in time and start taking over the tower. Zukovsky frees Bond and M, but Elektra shoots him dead. Bond chases her to the top of the tower. Elektra says he won't kill her because he loves her.
Dive, Bond!
Wrong. Bond dives right after the sub. Bond sneaks aboard and frees Christmas. He tries to surface the sub but capsizes it instead. Renard shows and fights Bond, but it doesn't look so good until 007 impales him with a plutonium rod right through the chest. Bond and Jones swim away as the sub blows up. Sometime later, Bond and Jones celebrate New Year's and, of course, bone in full view of MI6's satellites. This guy's boss has seen him have so much The Last Brosnan outing, Die Another Day, is the most insane, but is definitely iconic for 90s kids. Let's get into it. Bond arrives in North Korea via surfboard, setting the tone for this wild movie. He assumes the identity of an arms dealer and heads to a military base to meet with Colonel Tan Sun Moon, who wants to trade weapons for diamonds. Moon also shows his arsenal, including hovercrafts that can float over the mines in the demilitarized zone on the border. Bond's cover is blown when Moon's right-hand man Zhao is tipped off. Moon tries to kill him, and a hovercraft chase ensues. In the fight, Bond sets off a suitcase bomb, full of the diamonds he traded, and they get lodged in Zhao's face. Bond is held captive for over a year until he's traded for Zhao, who was recently captured. Bond meets with M, who tells him he's no longer a 00 agent, as MI6 can't trust that he didn't leak info during his torture. Bond is convinced that he has been set up by a double agent in the British government. Now a captive of his own country, 007 tricks his heart monitor into flatlining, causing a med team to extract him. He takes them out and realizes he's at sea. He swims to shore and discovers he's in Hong Kong. Bond rendezvous with an old contact, Chang, from Chinese intelligence. Chang sets Bond up with a new passport and tells him that Zhao is in Cuba. Bond heads to Havana and is directed to a gene therapy clinic. He also encounters NSA agent Jinx Johnson on the beach near the facility. Halle Berry wears another iconic Bond girl bikini. Ooh, is it hot in here? They hook up and she's gone the next day. Bond sneaks into the clinic by posing as a man in a wheelchair, Lassie. He discovers Zhao is undergoing gene therapy to change his appearance. Jinx, who separately infiltrated the building, kills Dr. Alvarez, the leader of the clinic, while Bond confronts Zhao. Zhao escapes, but leaves behind a pendant. Bond sees Jinx making a stylish exit, jumping off of the cliff. Bond finds diamonds left behind by Zhao and gets them analyzed later. The diamonds put Bond on the trail of billionaire Gustav Graves. Bond returns to England and visits Graves at his fencing club. He also meets the stunning Miranda Frost, Graves' assistant and an underground MI6 agent. Bond and Graves get into a fencing match with simple rules. First to bleed loses. It gradually escalated until they're swinging claymores at each other. Bond cuts Graves and earns his respect. Graves invites Bond to see his project in Iceland, Icarus. Later, Bond meets with M, who cautiously gives him 00 status again. Q gives Bond an Aston Martin that can turn invisible because we left the laws of logic sometime back in the Roger Moore era. Bond visits Graves at his ice fortress in Iceland. I guess they don't call it Iceland for nothing. Graves unveils Icarus, a satellite that is able to direct concentrated solar power on a small area and provide year-round sunshine. Bond follows henchman, Dr. Kill, but trips an alarm. Miranda Frost helps him hide in time. Meanwhile, Jinx infiltrates the palace but is quickly caught by Graves, who takes her out with electric gloves. Bond spends the night with Miranda, then returns to the diamond mine. He finds Mr. Keel about to kill Jinx, but uses the diamond-cutting laser to kill Keel instead. Jinx finally admits to Bond that she's NSA. Next, they use Keel's arm so Bond can access the facility to look for Graves. Bond confronts Graves, who's revealed as Colonel Moon. He secretly survived the hovercraft chase in the beginning. Miranda shows up next and points her gun at Bond. Turns out she was the mole inside MI6 who caused Bond to be compromised in North Korea. Bond is defenseless and goes on the run in an ice dragster. Graves fires Icarus, which is actually a laser beam, and Bond runs it until he is out of ice. He parachutes off the cliff and surfs a wave caused by the falling ice. Not long after, Bond sneaks back into the facility, but his invisible car gets compromised. Zhao and Bond get in a gadget car showdown that ends with Bond killing him with an ice chandelier. Bond finds Jinx and revives her in a hot pool after she's almost drowned. Next, Bond and Jinx follow Graves' trail back to Korea at the demilitarized zone. They stow away on Graves' cargo plane, then go to an Air Force base. Graves meets with his father, who's a high up in North Korea, and reveals his identity. He also reveals Icarus is designed to destroy Mind in the DMZ, allowing North Korea to take the entire peninsula. The general says no, so Graves kills his dad. Bond bursts in, but gets blocked by a soldier. His gun goes off, and the plane's fuselage is punctured, causing the plane to decompress and fall. Bond and Graves fight while Jinx tries to control control the plane. Frost attacks Jinx and they get into a sword fight, which ends with Jinx victorious. The plane passes through the Icarus beam and gets rocked. Graves tries to escape, but Bond pulls his parachute early, which sucks him into one of the plane's engines, disabling the Icarus beam. Bond and Jinx jump on a helicopter in the cargo and get out, with Graves' diamonds. Sometime later, at MI6 headquarters, Moneypenny gets hit with Bond's resignation papers. They make out, but wait, it was all virtual reality. The real Bond is out with Jinx on a bed of diamonds, a fitting send-off to a great Bond. The most crazy entry leads into what might be the best Bond movie of all time. Next comes Casino Royale, which brings us to our most recent Bond, Daniel Craig, who is simultaneously the most muscular and the most emotional. This is a fan favorite era, as it modernizes the series with gritty action, realism, and less emphasis on gadgets. It also serves as the first movie in a brand new continuity exclusive to Craig. This one opens itself up as distinct right away, with a moody black and white intro that cuts between Bond's first two kills that earn him 00 status. One is a shady office meeting, the other a bathroom brawl. He turns around to take a crook out, and it segues into the gun barrel opening. That is the coolest thing ever. After the opening titles, we cut to a meeting orchestrated by Mr. White, a criminal contact who will show up a few more times. The clients are the always creepy Mads Mikkelsen as Le Chiffre, an evil banker who involuntarily cries tears of blood, just like the real Mads Mikkelsen. Also present is Stephen O'Bano, a rebel army commander. Le Chiffre takes $100 million from O'Bano and intends to use it as an investment scheme.
$1 million!
Okay, back to 007. He's in Madagascar in the middle of an insane chase. What else is new? The sequence has to be some of the most memorable action in the series and establishes a shift to a more Jason Bourne-style realism. Bond takes out his target but accidentally destroys an embassy in the process. Bond heads back to England to meet with M, played again by Judi Dench, making this the only crossover from the Brosnan era. This isn't any old meeting. He sneaks into her freaking house. M is skeptical whether promoting Bond to 00 was a good idea. She wants him to take some time off because terrorists want to kill him due to what happened in Madagascar. This doesn't stop him from pursuing a lead to investigate Alex Dimitrios, a corrupt Greek guy who was involved in the terrorist attack on an aerospace facility. Bond heads to Miami and starts big dickin' Dimitrios immediately. He wins his vintage Aston Martin in a poker game and bangs his wife, Solange. Bond tracks Dimitrios to the airport where he's planning another attack. They get into a knife fight where Bond kills him. 007 stops the terrorist attack that Le Chiffre would have benefited from, which causes him to lose O'Bano's money. M intercepts Bond on location and sets him up with his new mission. Le Chiffre now owes a ton of money and is organizing a Texas Hold'em tournament at Casino Royale in Montenegro. Bond gets the case because he's really good at poker and they want him to beat Le Chiffre, to put his life in danger, and to force cooperation with the British. Bond heads to Montenegro and meets another agent, Vesper Lind, who's handling the money MI6 needs to buy into the event. She's by far the most consequential Bond girl since Tracy, but we'll get to that later. At their hotel, O'Bano shows up to threaten Le Chiffre. Bond tries to sneak around but gets spotted, leading Bond to kill O'Bano and his men. The next morning, the poker game begins, and Bond does not do too well. Le Chiffre is an expert and notices Bond's tell, rubbing his temple. Bond needs more money to continue, but Vesper won't allow it. The good news is, there's another spy around, CIA agent Felix Leiter. I guess some things never change. He gets Bond more money if he promises to let the CIA take down Le Chiffre. At a later game, Bond's drink is poisoned. He excuses himself and has to use a defibrillator back in the Aston Martin. Vesper comes just in time to revive him. Bond comes back to the game and wins it all, using his tell against Le Chiffre. Later that night, Vesper says farewell to Bond and goes to meet another MI6 agent, who Bond believes could be a mole. He hops in the Aston Martin and finds Vesper tied up in the middle of the road. He swerves to avoid her and crash. Not the Aston Martin! They get kidnapped and brought to an abandoned ship. Le Chiffre tortures Bond by hitting him repeatedly in the balls. It's honestly really disturbing. Ooh. But Bond hangs on. At that moment, Mr. White bursts in and kills Le Chiffre because he's a fool who failed his mission of being an effective terrorist. Later, Bond wakes up in a hospital next to Vesper. They fall for each other, and Bond resigns from MI6. Wait, isn't his career just getting started? Wow, this Bond isn't even a hoe! They honeymoon in Italy when he gets a call from M, who says his money from the tournament was never transferred back to England. Who was in charge of that? Vesper. She double-crossed his ass. Vesper runs off, but Bond traces her to an exchange for the money. He gets spotted, and men take her captive inside a sinking palace. Bond takes out the shooters and causes the building to further sink into the canal. Vesper gets trapped in an elevator cage. Bond dives in to rescue her, but it's too late. She locks herself in and dies. Okay, honeymoon over. Bond rejoins MI6. M tells him that the organization behind Le Chiffre blackmailed Vesper by threatening Bond's life. Bond checks out Vesper's phone and discovers Mr. White's contact. He was behind the deal where she died. Bond locates White and snipes his leg, and Craig finally gets to say the catchphrase.
The name's Bond. James Bond.
The next film, Quantum of Solace, picks up right after Casino Royale. Bond drives a captured Mr. White through Italy while being chased. This movie really leans into the early 2000s shaky cam action, so you might get a little nauseous. Bond brings White to M, where he's revealed he's worked for a criminal network called Quantum, which we'll come to find out has ties with Spectre. Before they can learn more, M's bodyguard, an undercover agent of Quantum, attacks. Bond kills him, but White escapes in the chaos. Next, Bond and M head to her bodyguard's home and discover he was corresponding with a man named Edmund Slate, located in Haiti. Bond tracks him and discovers his employer is an environmentalist entrepreneur named Dominic Green. He uncovers a plot that Green is helping an exiled Bolivian General Medrano to overthrow Haiti's government and become the new president in exchange for Green gaining some random land in the desert. Why does he want that? Anyways, Bond then foils an assassination attempt from Camille Montez. She'll be back. Next, Bond tracks Green to an opera and infiltrates a Quantum meeting. He discovers the heads of Quantum, but gets discovered and gets into a shootout. M wants Bond called off the job, but he decides to go rogue instead to avenge Vesper. Next, Bond goes to meet Renee Mathis, an MI6 agent who appeared in Casino Royale. They head to Bolivia and get intercepted at the airport by Strawberry Fields, who demands Bond return to the UK. Guess we're back to the ridiculous name. The hell? Bond being Bond seduces her instead. That night in La Paz, they attend a fundraising party hosted by Green. Bond meets Camille there again and leaves with her. On the way home, they get pulled over by the cops, who find Mathis knocked out in the car's trunk, which was planted by Quantum. The cops shoot Mathis, and Bond takes them out. The next day, Bond and Camille fly a Bolivian fighter plane to spy on Quantum's intended land purchase. One of Green's men meets them in the sky, but they trick the plane into destroying itself. They deduce that Quantum has been secretly damming Bolivia's supply of fresh water to control it. Back in La Paz, Bond meets up with M and learns that Quantum killed Fields by drowning her in oil, in an homage to Jill's death in Goldfinger. Bond meets up with Felix Leiter, who tells him that Green and Medrano are meeting in the desert to finalize their agreement. Bond and Camille infiltrate the hotel that hosts this meeting. Green gets Medrano to sign a contract that makes him the leader of Bolivia in exchange for Green finally getting that hot desert property, which would make him the only water provider for the country. Bond crashes the party and confronts Green, while Camille kills Medrano. The battle destroys the entire facility. Bond captures Green and interrogates him about Quantum, but the answers aren't satisfying. Bond maroons him in the desert with only a can of oil to drink. Later in Russia, Bond locates another Quantum member involved in Vesper's death, but this time, he lets MI6 make an arrest. Outside, M tells Bond that Green was found shot dead in the desert. Damn! These Quantum guys are real powerful. How did they find him? M tells Bond she needs him back.
Bond, I need you back.
Bond drops a necklace from Vesper in the snow, finally ready to move on. Next is Skyfall. This was supposed to be Craig's last Bond film, and they pulled out all the stops. It's also the first time an Oscar-winning director helmed a Bond film. Shoutouts to Sam Mendes! Bond is mid-mission in Istanbul, accompanied by Eve Moneypenny, who in this incarnation is an MI6 agent. Bond ends up fighting his target on a moving train. M remotely orders Moneypenny to take out the target, but she hits Bond instead. He falls off the train and the target escapes with a hard drive full of info that will compromise other agents. Bond sinks as the Oscar-winning theme song starts. Adele can freaking sing! 3 months later, M is under scrutiny for her handling of that situation. She walks out into MI6 to discover their computers have been hacked. She receives a message taunting her, then the building blows up. Elsewhere, Bond, who used his death to retire and is living the island life, learns about this attack and comes back to MI6. He fails all of his assessments. This Bond is clearly washed up. Regardless, M says he can come back. He's assigned to find the hard drive and kill the target. He also meets Q, the first appearance in this canon, who hooks him up with a radio beacon and a new pistol.
Were you expecting an exploding pen?
The search leads Bond to Shanghai. He stalks the target, but he dies before Bond can learn who he's working for. Bond discovers a casino token on the target, leading them to a casino in China. Once he arrives, Bond is approached by Severine, a slave, rescued by a criminal who now employs her. She warns Bond about her bodyguards and promises to help if Bond kills her boss. Bond, of course, can never leave a damsel in distress, so he kills the bodyguard and takes off with Severine on her yacht. They go to an abandoned island off the coast of Macau, where they meet the mastermind, Raul Silva. In a classic villainous monologue, Silva explains he used to be a former MI6 agent, then turned to terrorism after a mission left him disfigured. He blames M for abandoning him in the field. Silva puts a scotch glass on Severine's hand and tells Bond to shoot it. Bond misses completely, and Silva puts a bullet in her head. Bond uses Q's radio beacon to alert MI6, and Silva is captured. At MI6's new underground headquarters, Q tries hacking Silva's laptop, but it instead gives access to the MI6 servers, and Silva gets out. He wanted to be captured. It was all part of the plan. Bond chases Silva through the subway and manages to stop an attack on Parliament, where M M is present. Silva gets away. Bond decides to set a trap himself. He takes M in his Aston Martin to Skyfall, his childhood home in the Scottish Highlands. He tells Q to lead Silva there. They meet Skyfall's gamekeeper Kincaid, who's kind of Connery-esque. They rig the house with traps. That's right, they're pulling a Home Alone. Silva's men arrive and the trio takes him out, but M is wounded. Silva arrives by helicopter with more guys, so Bond sends M and Kincaid through a passageway to hide in a nearby church. He rigs the house to explode and follows them. Silva somehow survives the blast and chases our heroes. Silva forces his gun into M's hand and presses his temple to hers.
With the same bullet.
Bond arrives in the nick of time and kills Silva by throwing a knife into his back. M can't hold on anymore and dies from her wound. Bond holds her and almost sheds a tear. Sometime later, Bond catches up with Moneypenny. She tells him she's done in the field and will now be secretary for the new M, played by Ralph Fiennes, who you might know as Voldemort. Bond is ready for his next mission. The Craig saga continues in Spectre. The cold open finds Bond at the Day of the Dead festival in Mexico. 007 stops a bombing attack and kills its perpetrator, Marco Sciarra. On Sciarra, he discovers a ring with an octopus, which fans will recognize as the Spectre logo. This mission is revealed to have been given via a pre-recorded message from Judi Dench's M. If she died, Bond was supposed to kill Sciarra and attend his funeral. Back at MI6, the current M suspends Bond for his unapproved mission. It isn't business as usual at MI6. M's authority is challenged by Max Denby, also known as C. He's the head of a new private intelligence service that is overseeing a merger of MI5 and 6. C wants to shut down the 00 program in favor of a new multi-country intelligence group, Nine Eyes. Bond is not having any of this and secretly goes to Rome to attend Sciarra's funeral, with Q and Moneypenny helping. At the funeral, Bond meets Sciarra's widow, Lucia. He seduces her and learns about a secret meeting of Sciarra's syndicate, organized by Franz Oberhauser, a terrorist presumed dead for 20 years. Using Sciarra's ring, Bond shows the ring and gets into the meeting. He spies on the organization's leader, who's hidden in shadow. Oberhauser targets the Pale King for assassination. Then, Oberhauser calls out Bond by name. This guy's good. His men pursue Bond, and he escapes in a souped-up Aston Martin, chased by the organization's #1 assassin, Mr. Hinks. Later, Bond learns from Moneypenny that the Pale King is Mr. White, our old friend from Casino Royale and Quantum. Bond tracks Mr. White to Austria. He's dying from atomic chemical poisoning, which was given to him by the organization after he left their ranks. Bond discovers White has a daughter, Madeleine Swain, and offers to protect her. She also knows where Bond can continue his search. Later, White commits suicide, and Bond finds Swan at her job at a psychiatric clinic. She's reluctant to trust him, but is forced to when Hinks shows up and takes her. Bond chases her by plane, eventually forcing them to crash. He recovers Swan, and they go to meet Q, getting into an intense chase along the way. Q says he analyzed the octopus ring and has data that connects Le Chiffre, Dominic Green, and Raul Silva all to the same shadowy organization, run by Oberhauser. Swan finally gives it a name.
Its name is Spectre.
Swan takes Bond to L'Américain, a hotel in Tangier. Bond finds a secret room built by White that leads them to investigate a base Oberhauser has in the Sahara. They take a train and Hinks ambushes them, but Bond throws his ass off. Bond and Swan hook up after, cause there's nothing hotter than killing a guy. Later, Bond and Swan reach the base, and Bond gets taken and tortured by Oberhauser in a neurological probing chair. Oberhauser Oberhauser reveals the Nine Eyes program is all part of Spectre's plan, and C is a double agent. He drops an even bigger bombshell though. Bond was adopted into his family, making them brothers. Oberhauser killed Bond's foster father as he thought he loved Bond more than him. Since then, he founded Spectre with the intent of killing Bond and took on a new name, Ernst Stavro Blofeld. Bond breaks out and stuns Blofeld with an explosive wristwatch and blows up the whole freaking base in the largest explosion ever created for a movie. Back in London, Bond and the MI6 crew gear up to arrest C, but Swan and Bond are separately abducted by Spectre. M and C end up in a fight, and M throws C off the roof. Meanwhile, Bond is taken to the ruins of MI6 headquarters, which is scheduled for demolition. Swan is captive there too. Blofeld, who now has scars from the events in the Sahara, gives Bond a choice: save Swan or himself. Bond goes after Swan. He reaches her as the building collapses, and they get out, escaping by boat. They chase Blofeld's helicopter, and Bond shoots it down. He wants to kill his adopted brother, but lets MI6 take him instead. After two sort of finales, No Time to Die brought the actual conclusion to the standalone Daniel Craig canon. Let's flash back to a young Madeline Swan. In a terrifying opening sequence, she hears her mother being murdered by a masked man who claims to be avenging his family. This is our intro to the devious Lucifer Safin. He comes for Swan next. She shoots him and runs away, falling into a frozen lake, but at the last second, she's pulled out by Safin. In the present, Swan and Bond are still dating and touring Italy, but Bond still has emotional walls up. He can't move on from the death of Vesper. Swan convinces him to visit her grave so Bond can hopefully move on. As he's looking at the tomb, it blows up, and Swan is gone. What? Bond gets attacked by a squad of Spectre operatives led by Primo, who has a bionic eye. After getting away, Bond confronts Swan, thinking it's a setup. He doesn't trust her, but helps her evade the Spectre agents in an incredible chase scene, where the Aston Martin shows off gadgets that would make the Batmobile jealous. He evades them and sends her away on a train, leading us into another Oscar-winning opening theme song by Billie Eilish. The third Oscar win in a row for the Craig series themes. 5 years later, Spectre agents storm an MI6 laboratory and kidnap Valdo Obruchev, a scientist who's working with Safin. They steal Project Heracles, a DNA-targeting nanobot that can be programmed to target an individual's genetic code. Essentially, it's the ultimate assassination machine. Meanwhile, Bond lives a chill, retired life in Jamaica until he's visited by Felix Leiter and Agent Logan Ash. They ask for his help in extracting Obruchev from Cuba, where Spectre holds him, but Bond says no. Later, he's visited by 007. What? Yeah, this girl, Nomi, took over his codename. She warns him not to interfere with the Obruchev mission, which, you know, is just gonna make him want to do it. Next, Bond calls M, who refuses to explain anything. Bond, now suspicious, accepts Felix's mission. In Cuba, Bond attends a Spectre party with CIA contact Paloma. Secretly, through Primo's bionic eye, Blofeld observes from prison. He orders Bond to be killed by the nanobots. At that moment, all the Spectre members drop dead. Turns out, Obruchev programmed the nanobots to sabotage Spectre. Bond heads on a boat out of there with Obruchev, Felix, and Ash, but Ash isn't who he says. Obruchev exposes him. Ash shoots Leiter and sinks the ship. He escapes with Obruchev. Felix isn't so lucky and succumbs to his wound as the ship sinks.
Felix,
Meanwhile, Safin blackmails Swan into infecting herself with nanobots. Bond is given the clearance to visit Blofeld, but what he's not prepared for is Swan, whom the other 007 brought to analyze Blofeld. They head to the cell together, and the plot is set into motion. In Blofeld's cell, Bond touches Swan and gets infected with nanobots. Swan, too distressed to face Blofeld, tells Bond she is going home. Blofeld brags about blowing up Vesper's grave earlier and admits to Bond that he framed Swan. Blofeld gets into his head, and Bond can't help but strangle him. Just a little choke.
Die, Blofeld, die!
He backs off, but moments later, Blofeld drops dead. Bond unknowingly infected Blofeld with the bots, killing him. Damn! This one should just be called All the Time to Die, because bodies are stacking up. Next, Bond finds Swan at her childhood home in Norway. They make amends, and he meets Swan's daughter, Mathilde, who Swan insists is not Bond's child, even though they look similar and is 5 years old, which is the same amount of time since she last saw Bond. Right. Swan shares what her father knew about Safin. He's the heir to a pharmaceutical family who was murdered by Mr. White for Spectre. Just then, Ash and his men appear. They chase Bond and the girls. He does some insane driving in a gadgetless car. The chase leads Bond, Mathilde, and Swan into the woods. Bond takes out the other men and saves Ash for last. That's for Felix. Meanwhile, Safin kidnaps Swan and Mathilde. Later, Q, Bond, and Nomi team up to set things right. Bond uses a glider to infiltrate Safin's nanobot factory headquarters, which is located on an island. They discover that Safin and Obruchev plan to bring about a new world order by having the nanobots infect significant targets, triggering social collapse. Bond takes out Safin's men, but Safin gets away with Mathilde and taunts her in a garden of poison plants. Later, Primo tries to make Mathilde drink an eye-damaging poison, but she splashes it in his face and escapes. Later, Swan and Bond find her. Meanwhile, Nomi kicks Obruchev into an acid pool, then meets up to transport Swan and Mathilde off the island. Bond connects with M and tells him to bomb the facility to stop the nanobots. During the assault, Bond blows up Primo's eye with a charge from his wristwatch. Ooh, great kill. Nomi extracts Swan and her daughter. Safin reappears and shoots Bond repeatedly. He breaks open a vial of nanobots that infect Bond, programmed to kill Swan and Mathilde. Bond accepts his fate. He shoots Safin and opens the facility's doors, creating the path for the missile strike. Bond stays behind, knowing he's doomed to never see the people he loves ever again. Bond radios Swan to say goodbye, and she drops the biggest bomb yet that we all saw coming. Mathilde is his child. Bond says he already knew, and for the first time in the series, James Bond, Agent 007, the immortal, unstoppable killing machine, finally dies. Later, at MI6, all the regular allies, including M, Q, and the new 007, drink whiskey to Bond's memory. I think he would have preferred a martini. The ending is Swan driving Mathilde to Italy, and she tells her about her dad.
About a man. His name was Bond. James Bond.
Hilariously, this one still has a title card saying James Bond will return in the credits, even though he just died. Zombie Bond? All that's known about the next installment is that it will be directed by the legendary filmmaker of Dune. Also, a new Bond video game is coming out soon. Who do you think should play Bond next? Let us know. Anyway, feel free to click on the video on screen to watch another one. And, peace!